here's essentially what happened. Initial reports from police said that that there was a fleeing vehicle, a pickup truck, but police later said that this officer was responding to a vehicle in a ditch, that he approached the vehicle and then was gunned down, opened fire, that he did not have a chance to return fire. That's according to the OPP commissioner. They've identified two suspects, or one of the two suspects, the male Randall McKenzie, age 25, and a 30-year-old female suspect. They were later apprehended. They're in custody. They're expected to be charged criminally by the OPP sometime later today. Again, though, this officer, his first day on the job as someone who was fully fledged, who had passed his probation and was able to work independently. He was gunned down. 28-year-old Greg Perscala. He had worked as a special constable at the Ontario Legislature. He was described as having been in the Canadian Armed Forces, that this was his dream job that he wanted to do from the age of 5 and was able to do it for about a year. The Ontario
Anti-Indigenous racism is real. People have suffered in violence. Indigenous people, Black people have suffered violence and have been killed at the hands of police here in Canada. I think about Stuart Kevin Andrews, a young Indigenous man killed in an interaction with the police in Winnipeg. And the anger and the frustration is how many more people need to die before there's action? How many more speeches will be made? How many more protests need to happen before something is done?
In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the Native Syndicate, an Indigenous-based crime gang active today in Saskatchewan, Canada. We'll get into the details of how it was formed, what kind of crimes they committed, and more. The Native Syndicate likes to recruit members when they're very young. We're not talking about people in their 20s here, we're talking early teens. The Native Syndicate was formed by unaffiliated inmates in Canada's Western Provinces prison system in 1994. This was due to the rapid strengthening of both the Indian Posse and Manitoba warrior gangs, making the need for gang protection, and thus Native Syndicate was born. The Indian Posse was involved in organized street crime, promoted drugs and prostitution, and was involved in assaults and break-and-enters. The gang was also very active in correctional institutions, using fear, violence, and intimidation to recruit non-members to keep control of their turf. Richard Wolf was only 13 when he bought his first handgun, and soon after he was keeping an AK-47 and getting involved in extortion. The gang was using children to run a lot of their operations, even tragically forcing girls as young as 10 years old for prostitution. Despite their claims of defending the Aboriginal families, the drugs they sold and the prostitution business they operated was all affecting the Aboriginal youth.
Reduce the level of violence that's taking place, not throughout our country, but in parts of our country where gangs are very active and where their violence is having such a devastating effect.
I can tell you that the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police have indicated that that won't make any difference. When we seize handguns, the handguns are always, almost 100%, in the possession of people who have no legal right to possess them. They're almost always legally obtained.
So we're doing all of that. We are changing our gun laws to promote safer communities, and we're doing it on the basis of the input and the feedback that we're getting from communities. The Canadian Association of the Chiefs of Police have said that Bill C-21 is a step in the right direction. Nearly 4 out of 5 Canadians support this law.
Is going to make it safer or easy for us is just nonsense. It won't make any difference whatsoever. There are handguns all over, they're all illegal, and they're in the hands of criminals. And that the people that legitimately own them, they're in safes and being taken to gun clubs. The two sections don't intersect. Is just another layer of, and I guess it might make some people feel good, but it will not change the threat level one iota.
Will some of that $300 million be going to help the CBSA stop guns crossing the border?
Undoubtedly, and CBSA has a really important role and has over the past decade been very effective in helping stem the tide of illicit guns that come. We border the largest handgun arsenal in the world.
Yeah.
And by the way, I very much appreciate it. I am also responsible for border security. We saw, for over a decade, significant cuts in the staffing and the resources of our Canada Border Security Agency and the RCMP that conducted organized crime investigations. They got shut down. The Integrated Proceeds of Crime Units, 12 of them across this country, was shut down in 2013. The officers that were dedicated to conducting, in partnership with me when I was the chief in Toronto, the investigations into international cross-border smuggling of firearms.
Four were untraceable. 4 of the AR-15 types were untraceable. No serial numbers, no make and model. Of the remaining 58 that were traced, 57 were traced to the United States, to US, primarily Arizona and Texas. And only one of these firearms was traced to Ontario. It was a stolen firearm from a break-and-enter back in 2021. So in essence, the overwhelming, whatever that is, 98% of these firearms are traced from the US. So that speaks to the Chief's comment about our border integrity and the flow of illegal crime guns coming up from the United States.
CBSA has really proven effective. And what we've seen, I will tell you, 10 years ago, 70% of all the crime guns that we seized in my city were sourced originally in the United States. And what we're seeing is that number that percentage of crime guns has dropped to around 30%. And so far more often now, our gangs are obtaining their guns domestically.
How many more times will people plead to breathe? How many more times will they plead to live? People are angry. They're feeling like enough is enough.
Enough is enough. We have to be united in solidarity to solve the scourge of gun violence once and for all, and it's going to take all of us.
Why do they need to keep on asking? Why do Black people, why do Indigenous people need to keep on asking to be treated like a human? Why? You know what? People are done with pretty speeches, particularly pretty speeches from people in power that could do something about it right now if they wanted to. The Prime Minister of this country has the power to go beyond pretty words and pretty speeches and do something.
But as I said earlier, it's not just about controlling the supply of guns. It's also about controlling the demand for guns. And there are demands among our young people. If people are afraid, if our kids are afraid, some of them might be tempted to acquire a gun to protect themselves. If a gang is in a dispute with another gang over turf for whatever reason, then they may be inclined to go and get their hands on guns to advance their own criminal purposes. We've got to work in our communities to keep our kids out of those gangs and to help our kids feel safe and secure in their own communities.
Launched Bill C-21. It will introduce red flag laws to offer more protection specifically for those who have come into contact with gender-based violence and domestic violence. by allowing people to go to court and asking a judge to either seize a license or to take away a gun, but with additional protections for the identity of those individuals. Introduce a national handgun freeze, reversing the trend of a growth of a particular type of gun that has grown on average between 45 and 55,000 new registrations each and every year over the last decade.
You mentioned communities. In November, Minister Goodale said the government was setting aside, what, $327 million? That's over 5 years to help fund anti-gun and gang initiatives. I'd like, if I may, to ask you to react to Mayor John Tory's comments at the summit today about that. Listen to this.
When they flow through the provinces, somehow these very large sums of money that are allocated to address things like I've been talking about seem to disappear into the ether. And that what happens is that the people who are on the ground actually having to deliver on these social challenges that we face in order to prevent gang activity and keep young people away from gangs don't end up with it.
And the more that Canadians understand the good that it will do, the more we can get behind it. And that's why I'm going to continue to work with all parliamentarians to read this law, to debate this law, and to pass this law as quickly as possible. That's my commitment to all Canadians. But it's not going to be enough. Bill C-21 by itself is not a foolproof strategy.
The federal government has made an enormous commitment of over $327 million to put into this, but we want to get a good return.
And that's why today's announcement, which is the next phase of rolling out a $250 million fund called the Building Safer Communities Fund, is so important. Now, one of the things that I want to just explain to folks is that in order for this program to be successful, we need to work with the grassroots. We need to work with community leaders. We need to work with great municipal leaders like Mayor John Tory. And I want to take a moment to thank you, John, for all of your collaboration in this space. Because I know, like you and like others who are with us today,
we need those resources immediately. We only have about 9 to 11 officers in the field. We have one boat. I now say this to the Premier, Premier Ford, and to Prime Minister Trudeau. Open up your considerations to flow the necessary, adequate financial resources to get this job done.
So I call on the Prime Minister in this Hall of Power, if the Prime Minister believes that Black Lives Matter, will the Prime Minister commit to ending racial profiling in our country? If the Prime Minister believes that Black Lives Matter, will the Prime Minister commit to ending the over-policing of black bodies? If the Prime Minister believes, truly believes, that Black Lives Matter, will the Prime Minister commit to ending the over-incarceration of black people in this country? Now, if the Prime Minister truly believes that Black Lives Matter, will he commit to ensuring that there's race-based data to make better decisions? Will he commit to ensuring that there's access to education, to health resources? The Prime Minister has the power to do all these things right now. The Prime Minister simply needs to get it done. If the Prime Minister truly believes that Indigenous lives matter, then similarly, the Prime Minister must commit today to ending the racial profiling of Indigenous people, the over-policing of Indigenous people, and the over-incarceration of Indigenous people. If the Prime Minister truly believed that Indigenous lives matter, the Prime Minister could stop taking Indigenous kids to court. The Prime Minister could stop delaying the action on the calls for justice for the murdered, missing, and Indigenous women and girls. If the Prime Minister believed that Indigenous lives matter, he could ensure that there's clean drinking water, access to justice, and education, and housing right now. People don't want peace. They don't want an absence of tension. People want the presence of justice. People want justice. People deserve justice. People need justice, and justice is what people will get. Nothing less will do. Thank you.
Important to get all three levels of government in the room to have a discussion and to come to some common agreement on what needs to be done.
I rise today to address what so many people of color live with every day. Over the past few days, we've seen horrific reports of police violence against black men and women, but these are not isolated incidents or elsewhere problems. Prejudice, discrimination, and violence is a lived reality for far too many people.
Gun violence in Toronto has exploded over the past 6 years. It's happened because our politicians 6 years ago effectively banned our police from doing street checks. And now other parts of the country look like they're about to make the same mistake, the most recent example being in Alberta. A street check is a fundamental tool of police intelligence gathering. What the police do is they interview people on the street who aren't charged with a crime to gather information about what's going on in the community. They record the information, the name of the person, and they put it into a central police database. So it's also known as carding. Now, carding works. In 2005, after a particularly violent year of gun violence that became known as the Summer of the Gun, Bill Blair, the then Toronto Police Chief, who's now Justin Trudeau's Public Safety Minister, introduced a policy of enhanced street checks. Between 2005 and 2014, the number of shootings in Toronto dropped by 32%, and the number of people killed and injured in them dropped by 55%. But after carding was abandoned in 2014 because of allegations the practice was racist, the number of shootings in Toronto have gone up 178% from 2014 to 2019, and they've gone up, the people injured and killed, that number's gone up 178%. And this year, even with the pandemic, is the second worst year for shootings, the worst year being last year. Now, there were problems with carding or street checks. Some police officers abused the practice. And there was an informal quota system, which meant that black people, innocent black people, were being disproportionately stopped and questioned by police. But carding was never supposed to be abandoned. The then government of Kathleen Wynne, the former Liberal Premier of Ontario, was supposed to introduce a regulation that would protect the rights of people interviewed by the police and let the police do their job. But even the judge who reviewed that policy for the province said it was unworkable, and the policy fell into disuse. And so now we're reaping the whirlwind of runaway gun violence, and our politicians won't talk about it, because they're scared if they do, they'll be accused of racism. So the only advice I have for people in the rest of Canada is don't make the mistake we made in Toronto. I'm Laurie Goldstein of the Toronto Sun. We're always interested in hearing your views, and please follow us on Facebook and our YouTube channel.
Is Bill Blair. He's the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Justice, and of course, for 30 years a cop, and 10 years, was it, as police chief in Toronto? Sir. So you must have heard it all on this topic. Did you hear anything today that could help reduce gun violence?
Yeah, we heard a lot of very important things today, Terry, and you know, the nature of gun violence and gang violence in this country has continued to evolve. And, you know, we had a very serious spike a number of years ago, and we responded at that time.
But if you talk about gangs and guns, you've got to talk about drugs too, right? I mean, I was looking at the numbers for opioid deaths, over 1,000 opioid-related deaths in Ontario alone in the first 10 months of 2017, a 52% increase over the year before. How big a role do you think drugs are playing in this increase? In
Street
crime?
gangs are criminal organizations, and their primary source of income is through drug trafficking. Frankly, it's the easiest money they make. And the violence that takes place between the gangs doesn't happen in every community. It happens in certain communities where there's also issues of poverty and unemployment and exclusion and, you know, a sense of isolation within those communities. And we need to do a better job of investing in those communities and addressing unemployment and early dropout rates and all the social determinants of that violence as well.
I am very pleased to announce that the City of Toronto will receive up to $12.3 million in funding through the Building Safer Communities Fund. This funding will support community-led projects to combat gang violence and activities among at-risk children, young people, and young adults in Toronto. I want to highlight that this new fund uses data and evidence, including population and crime statistics, to determine where investments should be allocated. It's a very smart and targeted approach that will ensure that communities who are most at risk will receive the support in a timely manner to invest in the safety of their residents.
I simply don't see, as a 27-year veteran, how adding another layer of law will make any difference anywhere in this country.